A Texas jury heard the testimony. They heard the arguments about self-defense. They heard about fear. They heard the arguments about split-second decisions. And then they reached a verdict in less than 3 hours. Guilty of murder.
Breaking Karmelo Anthony has been sentenced to 35 years in prison. Anthony was found guilty of murder on Tuesday for the stabbing death of Austin Metcalf at a high school track meet. He will be eligible for parole after half time served.
But here's what most headlines miss. The jury didn't just reject self-defense. There were other things they rejected.
The prosecution brought the case and they have the burden. What that means is they need to prove each element of the causes of action. And so the charge was murder. And for the prosecution standpoint, in order to prove that, they must prove that defendant intentionally or knowingly killed another person or intentionally caused them harm. Intent is really key.
They rejected manslaughter. They rejected sudden passion. They rejected every major off-ramp available. And that's the mystery. Because in Texas, it's a stand your ground state. Neither teenager had a legal duty to retreat.
At the sentencing hearing, the defense called only one witness on Anthony's behalf, his mother, Kayla Hayes. What did you tell the jury?
To have mercy on my son.
We have compassion in our hearts, and we send our thoughts and prayers to the family who lost Austin Metcalf. His twin brother, during the victim statements, stated, "You took a son, a brother, a friend, and my best friend from this world. You took someone from me who was supposed to be an uncle, godfather to my kids. Now I want everything taken from you."
So if retreat wasn't the issue, what was?
He's 19 years old. This happened when he was 17 years old, so he's not eligible for the death penalty. And I'm going to say something that folks aren't going to like, but thank God. He's not eligible for the death penalty. I feel like he was poorly served by his defense team. Bakar, I'm eager to hear what you have to say about that.
That's facts.
I feel enraged. I feel like there's no way that this should have been a first-degree murder charge. I don't understand how they got a manslaughter instruction and they didn't consider manslaughter. I don't understand how you deliberate for someone's entire future for under 3 hours.
I think the answer may be found in the 10 seconds. The 10 seconds before the stabbing. The 10 seconds that may explain the verdict. The 10 seconds that may explain why jurors reach clarity so quickly. And once we examine those 10 seconds, the entire case starts looking a little bit different.
This is the Hill of Justice.
I'm Jerome Hill, former state investigator and police officer. And with me, obviously, is my brother, former sheriff of Clayton County, Victor Hill. So most people think the case is simple, that the teenagers argued, one teenager suffers another, a stabbing occurs, case closed, right? That's not how investigators think about these things. Of course, investigators don't begin with the explosion. What we have to go ahead and take a look at is what began the fuse, because that's where the violence usually announces itself before it arrives. And the question isn't that simple for everyone about, okay, well, what happened? No. The question is what was building up to that point. And that's where choices are being made and what exists and what exits were available for people. And according to trial testimony, the interaction didn't begin with a stabbing. It began with a confrontation under intent. And that's the distinction that matters here. Because once jurors start examining that path rather than the destination, everything changes. You got to see a little bit of this case. And now that we're looking at this, there's several things we want to talk about today, brother. Of course, Texas law. I think how people misunderstood this. We're talking about a stand your ground state. You want to give some of your thoughts about that?
Yeah, obviously there's no video of what happened, correct?
Correct.
So this is one of those rare times that somebody didn't have their phone or there's no camera in the room or any place like that, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so in situations like that, it's up to witness testimony and the believability. And a lot of people, one thing from being a former detective, a lot of witnesses see different things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you got to separate witnesses, because sometimes one witness will listen to what somebody else say and then they'll adapt that subconsciously as what happened, even if that's not what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And that gets very complicated in itself when you have a case that there's no video evidence, then it leaves everything up to conjecture.
Mm.
And you just never know, unless, I could hear that testimony, this is just a lot of questions that makes me answer. But here's what the major problem is. One person is armed with a knife and the other person isn't.
Yeah. And let me go ahead and fill in some of the blanks. So for more than a year, people were asking, why didn't someone just leave? And sounds reasonable, right? But legally, that's not the central question. Because as we were bringing up about Texas being the stand your ground state, generally speaking, neither teenager had the legal duty to retreat if the legal requirements for self-defense were otherwise met. And it appeared to be it was. Now, I want people to now watch what happens. I know you want to go ahead and get into this, but the moment that people understand, I think that the debate changes. Because if Anthony had no duty to retreat, neither did Metcalf. And if Anthony could stand his ground, so could Metcalf. And that's where we're at.
Who initiated the physical contact? Do we know absolutely for sure?
It seems to be that Metcalf did. And it just spiraled out of control. And I just think that with a lot of witnesses going back and forth, he say, she say, and this is why I find this case so fascinating, because we're talking about the jury isn't deciding who should have walked away. I think they're deciding why was deadly force necessary in the first place.
Exactly. That's what I'm getting at. Okay, if a person pushes you and you push them back, okay. If they punch you and you punch them back, okay. If y'all tussle, y'all both go to the ground and you roll, okay. But, for it to escalate from hands to a knife is very interesting. And unless there were certain mitigating circumstances, I think that's where the real problem lies in that. But go ahead.
No, okay. So let's take a look at this. Let's just say one person's outnumbered by another, and you have the knife and you're outnumbered. Could you make a case?
Circumstance. That changes the circumstance.
Right.
Wasn't he a physical altercation with one person, or was he in a physical altercation with multiple people?
It seemed to be just one person. So, when you talk about fear, the fear doesn't have to be in front of you. You know that. It doesn't have to be that. It could be the surrounding areas too, where you're at. So I just think that, quite truthfully, it's illegal for you to have a knife on you. I think as much as it is a gun in Texas, but why? What was the articulation of using that? And I just don't think that, even if you had a provocation of any type or even an escalation in intent, the case gets very interesting after that, because with the reporting that emerged after the trial, there was more than one issue that kept appearing, and it kept on looking like provocation. So the one witness described an exchange that I think deserves much more attention than it received. And according to the testimony, Anthony allegedly said, "Touch me and see what happens," which is the bravado of a lot of teenagers. Touch me and see what happens. And then the other one went about saying, and I believe Metcalf is the one that said, "I'm not going to fight you on the track meet." And that's where we have to start with the pause. We don't know exactly how jurors interpret it, but I could tell you with statements like that, they probably looked at that as there was an opportunity there. And, I think this more than anything. Juries evaluate behavior, they evaluate tone, they evaluate intent. And if these jurors believe that exchange occurred substantially as described, let's just say it for face value, it was what it was. The case may have changed in that moment. And this is why. Because now the jury isn't evaluating fear. You move that to the side, because now there was a provocation and a bravado that was brought up. They're evaluating the challenge. Now we got a challenge in this. Now they're evaluating the escalation, and they're evaluating who was driving the confrontation. And that's a completely different framework than self-defense. And if the juries accepted that framework, which I think they did, they may have been in serious trouble from the get-go. And I'm talking about the defense.
Well, here's a problem that happens with court trials. A lot of people, they already have a preconceived notion of the case before it goes to trial. And if the jury comes back with a verdict that they don't think is proper, they didn't sit through the whole trial, they didn't hear the witness, they didn't see the evidence presented. And so, and that can go both ways. Sometimes people are convicted and people, well, something must have happened. But if they actually sat through the trial, they could see that there were things that weren't permitted or things that weren't allowed, and that this person probably was railroaded. And then also it could be that it was a trial where people did present evidence and it's very logical and it didn't take the jury time to perform. But, there's a lot we're in the dark in, without a video for you and I to look at, without us hearing the testimony of these witnesses to evaluate how believable they are and how much one witness statement corroborated another witness statement. I think it's hard to say that this jury did something wrong and or whatever. It's just so many factors are involved. And these cases are so complicated that unless you're there to actually sit in on it, see how the judge presided the case, was the judge fair? Did the judge stop the defendant from presenting evidence that could have helped him, or did he stop the other side? All that's a factor. But if none of that occurred and the evidence was presented, there's one, like you said, there's one major thing. You got one person armed and another person not. And if it was a physical altercation, how did it go from we're fighting physically to I'm going to get a knife? And then was the defendant injured, or you could see something where, okay, had he was getting injured so bad that had he not grabbed this knife and did what he did, he could well be dead. And if none of that was present, that's probably how we ended up where we're at now.
Right. And this is where I think that investigators and social media kind of split apart about this. Mm-hmm. Social media focuses on the shove, right? We don't focus on that. We're focused on what happened before the shove. And generally there's 4 minutes or so, or even longer than that could be a problem. So the reports during the trial suggested there may have been several minutes of interaction before the stabbing. And I think that's important because self-defense claims are strongest when the events unfold instantly. That's where you get the self-defense portion of it. But, it's unless you feel differently.
Yeah. And, there's a lot more to it too. Like you see two people get into a fight, mm-hmm. and one gets the best of the other, and the other person is obviously tapping out. Mm-hmm. But then they go in and they keep kicking and they keep punching and they keep kicking and they keep punching.
Right.
And in the beginning, it could have started out as self-defense. Mm-hmm. But now it has turned into something, okay, you were defending yourself fine, but you've already defended yourself now. You've defended yourself so well that the person gives up, but now you're going in for the kill. And so what started out as self-defense now has turned into a situation where now it's aggravated assault, or unfortunately, if the person passes away, murder. So a lot of people, I don't think, understand what a threshold is. And I think a lot of it, you and I are always going to judge by our training as former officers, but we're taught that, you can use enough force to affect the arrest, but nothing above and beyond.
Correct.
You can't go one step above to subdue a person because of what you're trying to do, because you're actually trying to physically restrain them.
Right.
But not 5 steps up.
Right.
It can't be you grabbed a person, they jerked away from you, they say you're not going to jail, and then you pull your gun and you shoot them. You say, well, it's self-defense. That's not self-defense.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? It has to be equal and reasonable force to match the force that you're dealing with.
Yeah. And what you're saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, minutes change everything.
Absolutely.
Minutes create choices. Minutes create opportunities. Minutes create missed exits. And
Yes.
Jurors understand this intuitively. And every additional minute creates another question. Why stay?
Sure.
Why continue? Why engage? Why escalate? And again, none of these questions automatically defeat self-defense. But they do create a different lens. And that lens is focused on decisions rather than reactions. And I think that that's the lens that may have been exactly what the jurors used on this.
Yeah, and that's probably it is. Yeah, if the situation was okay, you push me, well, I'm gonna pull out a gun and stab you. I mean, a knife and stab you. Correction. I'm gonna pull out a gun and shoot you, or I'm gonna get a baseball bat and start beating you with it. That's not really self defense. But let's say you push me and I make sure I get distance between us and I push you back or I push you down. Okay, hey, don't get up and come near me again. If the person doesn't get up and come near you again, okay, well, there's really nothing more to do. But self defense is you're doing enough to get that person off of you or enough to disable them so they can no longer continue to fight, which could be, that could be a numerous thing, submission, uh, whatever. I mean, if a person swings at you, you're able to duck and weave and punch them back, and the punch is so effective that they stop, they don't want no more. Well, that's self-defense. But if you go in and you start pummeling them and stumping them to death, that changes the situation completely. Or you escalate it to, you introduce a weapon. It's one thing, okay, this guy pulled the knife. Okay, well, I got a knife too. Okay, we're equal. Or he pulls a gun and you pull a gun. That's one thing. But if that person didn't pull a weapon and you pull a weapon, it takes it to another level. Now, here's what's interesting too. There's so many factors, and that's why I wish this was the one time somebody had their camera going or whatever. Let's say he pulled the knife, but he didn't actively try to stab him. And he pulled the knife and they just happened to stumble and fall. There's all kind of factors like that. That doesn't appear to be the case here. But, there are times where I've seen instances where people start tussling and a person falls. And once that person falls, they end up with some serious injury. Well, that wasn't the intent of the fall.
Right.
You didn't purposely take their head and ram it into furniture. But let's say y'all fall in and y'all both trip and you just hit the ground and his head just happens to hit furniture as you fell. There wasn't an intent there for that to happen. There was just an intent to get this person off you. But if you took this person and physically took his head and rammed it into that furniture,
correct,
then the intent was there. So you got to look at willful intent, which a lot of times is overlooked depending on who's prosecuting the case. But if the intent was to stab after a push, well, then that might be exactly why you saw a quick verdict in 3 hours.
Mm.
You know what I'm saying?
Right. And I think this is where the jury really lived at in that room. They didn't live in the politics. They didn't live in the social media or even the public arguments of this case. It was the final moments,
Right.
It was, and imagine you're a juror, right? And you hear testimony that someone said, touch me and see what happens. You hear testimony that another teenager responded that he wasn't looking to fight. You hear testimony about continued confrontation. Then you hear what happens next. And then you got to ask yourself, what story do these events tell? Who do I believe? Because that's where jurors aren't simply collecting facts. They're actually building a narrative, because a story is what tells them that what most likely happened than anything else. And the prosecution's narrative was escalation. That's where they lived at. And so those stories collided in the jury room. And based on the verdict that we know, that story won. And that's the fascinating question, is why did it win so decisively when you're in a state like that? And it was less than 3 hours. And I think what's maybe hidden is in the second verdict that people aren't talking about. And this is what I'm talking about. It's the verdict inside a verdict. And it was what was rejected. Not only was the self-defense, but it was other things that were rejected in the murder conviction.
Mm-hmm.
And so
that's real quick so we can discuss that.
Right. So if I'm looking at that, then the investigator should have focused on something else, right? And we do. And we focus on the rejection of, passion, sudden passion, right? And then, because sudden passion is essentially a claim that it was overwhelming emotion that drove the act itself. The jury rejected that, right?
Right.
And then you take a look at what else the jury rejected. They rejected manslaughter. Now that's big. So you got sudden passion that's out of there. You got self-defense that's out of there. And you got manslaughter that's out of there. I don't believe the teenager decided, I'm going to take this knife and kill somebody today.
Was this trial televised?
I don't know if it was or not.
Okay.
I do not know.
Okay.
But that's 3 separate opportunities to reduce the culpability of what happened. And the jury declined all 3 of them. And the question is, why? Because apparently they believe something stronger happened. It was a conscious decision, an intentional conduct, a choice that was made. And whether someone agrees with that or not, that was the conclusion. And this is what led to where we're at now.
Right. Right.
So that's where I think that this point is with the jurors that they've concluded with. And understanding jurors is also kind of understanding the case, because this is where they live at too with this stuff.
I agree. But let me tell you what I think is interesting and we need to discuss. My understanding is the way that trial went and the state laws there, that they had a choice whether the judge should decide sentencing or the jury could decide sentencing. Mm-hmm. And the jury actually could, and they actually opted for the jury to decide sentencing. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And the jury came back with how many years?
35 years.
Right. Right. So there must have been something there. Again, without hearing the testimony, I mean, how long did this kid live after he stabbed the kid and the kid was fighting for his life or whatever? Was there any remorse? Did he try to actually help to, like police officers, we are trained that, okay, if we shoot or injure someone, doesn't matter. At that time,
give aid.
We've got to give aid. There's all type of stuff and factors that we don't know what was said or what happened. I mean, after the stabbing, was there, what happened afterwards? Was there anything that happened that pushed the situation over the edge? We don't know because we didn't hear the testimony.
Right.
So it's easy just to hear a situation and think it's black and white, and it's not black and white. There's a lot of details that people don't know, and that's what happens.
And that's my point here.
Exactly. Right. That's happening a lot of trials. People think they know what happened. Well, he was convicted of doing this and that, and they don't understand the real facts. And unfortunately, in courts, that's the hardest thing to get out is facts. You'd be surprised how much.
Right. And,
misinformation is testified to, and then people got to sort through what's true and what's not.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point on there. And when we look at incidents like this, we often discover something uncomfortable all the time. There were warning signs and they were there. It's not always obvious, but they're there.
Tell me about them.
I mean, a challenge, you got an escalation, you got a bunch of teenagers around you got peer pressure, you got people who refuse to disengage. This was a recipe. And let this be a warning to everyone out there, especially young individuals that are, that have a bunch of vigor inside them and they feel like their manhood or their womanhood is being challenged. It's not worth it. I mean, you've seen it as much as I have. 5 seconds can change your entire life.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And it does often. And, we can take a look at a lot of our cases and we can go ahead and really boil it down to about 5 seconds.
Absolutely.
And that's
that anger.
Yeah.
And when you look back at it, you wonder, I'm sure that people wonder if I could do that all over again. I still think about a murder I worked where our aunt got in an argument with her nephew about who was supposed to take out the trash, and somehow it escalated. It's in dealing a knife too, and somehow she kept pointing the knife and hit him one time with it, and he ran out the house. But the one time he hit her was right there, and it actually severed a vein.
Right,
and he ran downstairs and then expired. And when EMS got there, they wasn't even sure what was wrong because there wasn't a lot of bleeding. The bleeding was internal.
Right.
So, no one could really figure out what was going on for a while, except it was just a little small entry wound. So it's very unique. It wasn't a lot of blood on the outside, very little. But I'm sure that she was sentenced to 20 years in jail. And, this was an argument that escalated. They actually called his mother, which is her sister, on the phone, and it was escalating and everything like that. And the next thing you get this. And unfortunately, she had a history of pulling knives and arguing with people. Excuse me. They never actually got to this point. But
yeah.
I'm sure the time she spent thinking about it, maybe she would have just took the trash out herself, or just lit the trash. Maybe no one takes the trash out.
Right.
But it's amazing when I look at the time in homicide that I spent, it was rare. I don't know if I ever remember a murder I worked that actually made sense after the fact.
Right.
I mean, I've seen some, I mean, one was a female that was called out her name, and a guy used the B word, and she pulled her gun as he was leaving and shot. And when everyone got there, what happened? And she said, he called me out my name. He called me a B. And I said, what else did he do? He called me a B. And she actually logically in that moment thought that she had a right to shoot because he used the B word.
Yeah. That was her emotional intelligence at the time.
Emotional intelligence at that particular time. And she was just trying to convince everybody, why did you shoot him? And I think she literally thought, oh, he did that. Okay, we understand. It's okay. Lord, just take the body and leave. Right. And I don't think people understand that. So, you're right. It's going to take, it requires emotional intelligence, but I don't think anyone's proven how to pass or teach emotional intelligence to people. Right. And because of that, this is going to be an ongoing problem for a long time to come.
Yeah. I mean, you got two families now buried in remorse,
Absolutely.
Buried in all types of, a media storm that this created. It's just the injury adds insult time and time again. You add the race card, you add the politics, you add everything that's involved in it. But at the end, you got two families that are sorely, sorely missing their loved ones tonight. One family will never see their loved one again. And the other one will definitely see theirs, perhaps at a much later time.
Right.
But, it brings down to what our young people deal with all the time. And, these confrontations that keep on moving forward instead of moving backwards. Yeah. And that's where I think that, if we want to take a look at one of the most important questions, it isn't who should have left. It's what was happening psychologically before the violence occurred.
Do we know what the argument was about?
It was about, well, we don't know in its totality because it's all over the place, but a storm was coming and a group of individuals wanted to get under a tent, and apparently there was a room or stuff like that. It just got ugly between two camps, and basically that's what the final minutes were, teenagers colliding together, egos exploding in front of people's face. And everybody has this big bravado, and nobody wants to back down or stand down, or everybody wants to go ahead and save face. And that's what the 10 seconds before the stabbing really was all about. And, the jury, as we know, rejected that it wasn't fair, and then, it wasn't sudden passion. And certainly, if they don't even believe there was panic. They just believed that there was a decision. They could have gone in a different way, and the jury believed that explains, and with what the jury believed, you can look at the speed of the deliberations. You can see how they went and chose, less than 3 hours, and, how they rejected the self-defense. They rejected the manslaughter. They rejected the passion. I really thought that the manslaughter was something that they could hold on to. Excuse me. And that wasn't it. It just wasn't. That was the surprising part of this case that I thought was, but they must have saw something that said
something that was said or something, right? Because usually those
correct.
cases are manslaughter cases in the heat of passion, anger, whatever like that, and active,
Right.
Yeah, there was something that was said, and unfortunately, like I said, it makes these cases even hard to comment on because unless we know the facts, it's easy if we got video evidence or whatever. But again, for us to really understand, we would have to listen to the testimony of all of the witnesses, and I guess you're saying there's about 10 of them.
Right. I do think that to end the show, we're talking about there's a teachable moment in the verdict itself. And I think that what it should teach, particularly a lot of young individuals, is that violence isn't the answer. Things can escalate real quick. And these type of decision making can lead you in prison for a very long time.
Absolutely. One thing that I'd like to add as we end this show, one of my teachers once told me something that I thought was very profound. He said, "He who is wise does not argue, and he who argues is not wise."
Mm.
That 10 years I spent in homicide, I can't think about one murder that I worked that wasn't preceded by an argument.
Mm.
And that's because that was a professional hit. Somebody paid him and he came in to do a job and leave. But every other murder is usually preceded by an argument. And it's important to learn how to avoid arguments. No one wins an argument. I can't remember anybody winning an argument. You and I can go back and forth. At the end of the day, you're still going to feel the way you feel, and I'm going to feel the way I feel. Unless we're having a calm conversation where I'm really listening to your logic and listening, you're like, you know what? I didn't realize that happened. Okay, I see what you're saying. That once it gets to the point where you're arguing, all logic goes out, and no one's going to win the argument anyway. And it's an important skill to learn to avoid arguing at all costs. And everybody, every now and then, no matter how good you get at it, someone can just catch you at an off or just push a button. And then you got to catch yourself and realize, why am I going back with this person? Why don't I just hang up the phone or leave? Because it's not going to go anywhere. But most all murders are preceded by an argument.
Right.
And usually the argument makes no sense. And you see a lot of arguing going on these days, especially with politics. People argue over what candidate they like and don't like. And, at the end of the day, you wonder, what's the argument for? If you like who you like who you like, and you vote for who you like. Us arguing over it means absolutely nothing.
Mm.
But you see a lot of conjecture and arguing as if though if you don't believe what I believe, then something's wrong. You have to think as I think or whatever like that. And I think that's probably the most important thing we could teach young people is that everyone has a right to their opinion, and you don't have to convince anybody that your opinion is right. If you have an opinion, keep your opinion and do your thing. But whether it's politics, go vote for who you want to vote for. But as far as arguing with people about who they voted for and why, that's the energy that creates a situation like what we got now.
Sure. We're going to go ahead and land this plane. Many of you at Hill Nation are subscribing, you're liking, you're going ahead and hitting the notification bell. We really appreciate that. But we want you to comment on this case because this case has driven social media nuts within the past week. And in particular, many of you have very strong emotional opinions about what happened in this case in particular. Let us know what you feel about this case in the comments. Brother, you brought it again. Once again, thank you so much. And
Thank you, brother.
Until next time.
You got it.
This is the Hill of Justice.